Thank you for coming. Thank you, the University of Nebraska, International Quilt Study Center, for inviting me. It's always fun to be in Lincoln. I think the first time I came was to I was invited to the Lincoln Quilt, the State Guild, by Sarah Dillow, and we traveled around the state, went to a quilt day, and then Mary and Louise Howie drove me back to Lincoln, and I stayed at Mary's house, and that was the first time I experienced the wonder that was Mary Gormley. I knew Mary Gormley before that through American Quilt Study Group. She and her husband would often come to the meetings, and I remember one time, it was probably when we were still meeting in California, she and I were sitting, Roger and Mary and I were sitting in the dining hall, and we were just kind of making connections. And somehow it came up that she went to Monmouth College. I went to Monmouth College. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. Right now I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. But I went to Monmouth College. It's a Presbyterian college, small liberal arts school in Western Illinois. She tells me her middle name is Campbell. I knew this is one of the founders, or a name with a lot of history at Monmouth. And I knew her niece, Nancy, great niece. And then we realized, I said, you weren't in a sorority, were you? Because Monmouth is known for founding two sororities, Pi Beta Phi and Kappa Kappa Gamma. And she said, I was a Kappa. And I went, I was a Kappa. Today, we have a few Kappas represented in this audience. We have the alumni. She just introduced herself, the alumni. You want to stand up, Lori? And we have another Kappa here, who's also a friend of Mary's. And another one, of course, Jan. Thank you. So we have 5 Kappas represented in the room. So we kept going. We met at meetings, and eventually Mary convinced me to write this book, Childhood Treasures, Quilts Made by and for Children. But that meant I went back to her house, not a bad thing. I could stay overnight, spent many nights on the back porch with Roger and Mary after days of working with the quilts. We talked some more. And I said something, he said something about some odd kind of group or some unusual name, and I said, what does that mean? He said, PEO. And I went, oh my gosh, Mary, you're a member of PEO? I'm a member of PEO. PEO was it is a very fine women's service organization. My mother was a member. I became inducted into it. I've never attended or been very involved in it, but I have friends all over the country who are involved. So here we had 3 or 4 things in common, but basically it was quilts that brought us together. And today I'm going to talk to you about the journey that Mary and I and Roger made in the making of this book called Childhood Treasures, Quilts Made by and for Children. Again, a little background. You heard about some of the things I research. I love a good story with a quilt. If there's a story with a quilt, I go for it, like the patchwork souvenirs of the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. If there's a kit, woo! I jump at that quilt and I say, I'm going to find out when this was made, because I can identify an advertisement maybe for that particular quilt. But a lot of Mary's quilts are anonymous, and very few had dates or names on them. So it was a hard little project. There were 300 quilts. I knew we couldn't put all 300 quilts in a book. We ended up choosing about 80, and that's all I'm going to say, because I'm going to tell you some of the background stories of the making of this particular book. You've probably heard, let's see if I can get this. This is my first PowerPoint presentation. I mean, in front of a significant crowd. I did run it by my quilt guild last week before I came, so I know how to do it. But anyway, here we go. Childhood Treasures, Quilts Made by and for Children. This is Mary's story. It's Mary's quilts, but I wrote the book with a lot of help from quite a few people. Here's Mary. Oops, Mary Campbell Ghormley. You know her. She lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. She has a long history of working with quilts, collecting quilts, working on the State Quilt Project. She's in the Quilters Hall of Fame of Nebraska. She's a dear, dear person. And in addition to collecting large quilts, she began to collect doll quilts. And it was kind of a side collection. She said it wasn't something she'd set out to do, but she just couldn't resist sometimes when she'd walk into an antique store and see a little forlorn little doll quilt and just asking to be collected. She collected different kinds of doll quilts. One like this, it's called Mill Wheel. That's the pattern name. It's about 28 inches long, 21 inches wide. It's one of Mary's earliest doll quilts. She purchased it in Winona, Illinois in 1974. She paid $7.50. Because of its curved, pieced, and complicated pattern and precise hand quilting, she's quite sure an adult made this quilt for a young child. But that's not all that Mary collected. She liked collecting the quirky, fun quilts that were probably made by children. They do have a certain charm and are just as collectible as the Mill Wheel quilt. The one on the left is just simply called 4-Patch Medallion. She named it that. It's 8 inches by 7.5 inches, and the one on the right is 9-Patch. It's 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches. It dates from the 1830s to the 1860s. The one on the left is a little later, 1900 to about 1910. If you've ever been to her house, you know that her attic was filled with doll beds, buggies, and quilts, of course. Each one of her doll beds was tagged. She collected her doll quilts and fitted each bed. She collected doll beds and fitted each bed with a mattress, pillow, and linen. Notice there are white tags attached to each bed which list the number of the quilt in her doll quilt collection that would fit on the beds. The kind of organizing and recording, it was just incredible. So, she's always said, I've heard her say in her lectures, when she talks about her doll quilts, I see myself as a conservator. I'm saving these quilts from being lost, destroyed, and underappreciated. She kept meticulous notes on each quilt she purchased. And modestly, she also claimed, I'm not the quilt scholar. Mary Kay, you are. Why don't you write a book on my doll quilts? I thought. I think I knew more, maybe she knew it too, that writing a book is hard. But you know Mary, how could I resist? I spent a weekend at her house looking through the quilts. They gave me my own bedroom. I selected quilts and she went to her notebooks to find information on each one. And you could see 3 of the quilts right here that I chose. And she could go to her notebooks, tell me where she bought them, how much she purchased it for, and hopefully there was a little bit about the maker. There really wasn't very much. This tied quilt, this is my hand showing it to Mary. She doesn't look terribly pleased about me choosing this tied quilt, and in fact, it wasn't one that ended up in the book. But I liked this quilt because of the fabrics and the simple design. She made sure I included enough of her favorite quilts in the book. It was this back and forth negotiation between she and I, and we eventually settled, as I said, on about 80 quilts. The final outcome was this book, Childhood Treasures, Doll Quilts by and for Children, published in 2008 by Good Books. Why Good Books? The International Quilt Study Center had a relationship with them. They had just published a book on Amish crib quilts, and so Dr. Cruz suggested that I go to them, make a proposal, and we asked David Kostelnik to do the photography. We chose quilts from Mary's collection, and I wanted to include vintage photos to kind of set the context of the quilts. So, and most of those photos are from the collection of Dr. Virginia Gunn of Akron, Ohio, Worcester, Ohio. So this is kind of how we set the scene at the beginning of each one of the chapters. And this was a fun part of doing the photography. We not only took the doll quilts to David Kostelnik's house, we took stuff from Mary's house. And it was easy to find things in Mary's house. So we looked for things from the 1830s, in this case things from the 1890s, 1900s. And then we'd maybe choose a doll that would match that era, the quilts that were going to be in the next chapter. We have a little cranberry glass from the 1904 World's Fair that was collected by Roger's mother. Unfortunately, this setting photo did not end up in the book. It was the first one we tried. I don't know why. We readjusted the chapters, but I love this one. And so now we get a chance to show it. I decided to use my quilt history expertise to choose the quilts for the book based on their fabrics, their patterns, and their style. And if there were any that had a date on them or a story, they definitely got in the book. But I think only 4 of them have a date on them or a story. So again, as I said, to create a context, we did these little settings. This one has the chintz quilt on it, on the bed. Notice we always tried to put something in it for scale. In this case, it's that blue candle. To look at this photo, you might think this was a big quilt, a big chintz quilt, but it's not. It's on a little doll bed. The quilt itself is only 17 inches by 17 inches. And then I asked Virginia Gunn for pictures. And she has a fabulous collection of photographs. She collects photographs for the costumes that are on the people in the quilts, because she teaches costumes, and she teaches costume history and textile history at the University of Akron. And this little girl is holding a doll. I asked her, this daguerreotype is from about 1850. This particular quilt was chosen for this chapter. It's called Hourglass. I dated the fabrics in this quilt to the 1830s. This quilt is only 15 inches by 15 inches. I was also fascinated by the way this quilt is pieced. Let's see if this, see in the center, see how there's a diamond right here? Right, oops, this doesn't work very well. And then see these little fussy cut ones right here? And these little corners, the little red corners. The binding is the same, same red print fabric as what's inside. This is a very controlled quilt, and obviously a quilt made it by an adult. Another one we chose for this particular chapter has cutout corners. This style of quilt was popular in New England throughout the 1800s. The fabrics in this quilt, though, are 1860s to 1870s. Since Mary had a bed for each quilt, we have a 4-poster bed to show how the design of the quilt works around the 4 posters. Also, during this time period, whole cloth quilts were popular up to about 1850. Here's a whole cloth quilt with fringe. This may not have been my favorite looking quilt, but I really wanted to include it. It's made of linen and it's hand quilted, but we cannot be sure just how old it is, because there are doll collectors who create, in this case it might have been a quilt made in the 20th century for maybe a 19th century doll. So we really aren't sure how old that is, but the fact that it's linen and that it's in the whole cloth style made it a pretty good choice for that particular chapter. This one is called Lemoine Star. It's 24 inches long, 18 inches wide. It's hand-pieced, but machine quilted. And really, in this time period, 1830s, up to 1850s, there aren't a lot of machines, and we don't see machine work very often in quilts. So I doubt that this style quilt was really made during this time period. It was probably made soon after the Civil War in 1870s. But it contains the fabrics of that era, and therefore I chose it for that chapter. Carolina Lillie is the name of this block in the center. Red and green was a popular pattern or color combination for 1850s quilts. The 10-inch block in the center serves as the centerpiece of this quilt. This style quilt was probably salvaged from another quilt project dating to the 1850s. The work is all hand done. One of the most interesting aspects and a surprise of this quilt is its back. And see, you don't see the backs of the quilts upstairs. So I'm giving you a little, little peek at what you're not seeing upstairs in the exhibit. This piece on the back of that quilt is a beautiful roller printed chintz fabric which dates to the 1850s. Another reason why I chose that particular quilt. The next chapter is called, we titled Frontier Quilts, 1870s to 1890s. And I was thinking at the time of quilts that were kind of made of salvaged fabric, and quilts made not necessarily with a published pattern. Log cabin quilts then work really nicely in this particular chapter. These vignettes, let's talk again about them, were designed by the photographer, David Kostelnik, and Mary and I, of course, helped a lot on it. It's hard. I mean, there's a lot of work involved in this. There always had to be a horizontal line, and it usually had to be, it kind of anchors the quilt, anchors the photo. He had the photography background, and then we had it on a table. And he had these wonderful photographs. Sometimes he could Photoshop and put pictures into them that we might have forgotten. He really did a lot of interesting things with this. And this is in about 2006 when we were doing the photography. This particular little tintype, again, is from Virginia Gunn. She dated it because of the costume that the little boy is wearing, to the 1880s, and also because of the tintype, the kind of photograph would be 1880s. Log cabin quilts, this one, sunshine and shadow variation. It's made of cotton prints from the 1890s to the 1900s. It's all hand-pieced and tied. This 16 patch is very small. It is upstairs. It's about 9 inches by 12 inches. The fabrics, you can see, there are little 16 patch blocks that are used in the center. The fabrics date to the 1880s. Mary commented on this quilt, "I think this quilt is child-made. The stitching is very crude. And also notice how the corners are rounded, but not the fourth one. Even without any quilting," she said, "it has a certain charm to it. And notice how the binding is folded over from the back." And here's the back on this one. A beautiful paisley print from, again, about the 1880s. You can see here this little, that's one of the little tags that Mary has left on every one of her doll quilts, giving the size, her inventory number, and the name of the block. For this particular quilt, we had to Photoshop that out. For the photo, we had to work it out. So anyway, it doesn't appear that way in the book. This quilt, I don't think has gotten a lot of attention. It's one of my favorite ones in the collection. And it is on view upstairs, so when we go up there later, look closely at it. It's 14 inches wide, 19 inches long. It's all machine quilted. You could see a close-up over here of the machine quilting from the back. It's done by machine. It's in crosshatch diamonds. I chose this quilt because, and it's made, I'm almost positive, by an expert tailor who had a machine that could do that kind of work. I chose this quilt also because of the borders. Look at the borders on the quilt itself. Those are printed lace borders that were popular in the 1880s. They show up sometimes in quilts, and especially in log cabin quilts. Here's a picture of similar examples of border prints. Someone sent to me recently, they were in a box of her great aunt's unfinished projects. Notice these are all, they were cut off of the edge of bolts of fabric, and some of them are in fact lace borders. Like you could see this one right in the center. Oops, I'm not going to play with that. Whoops, oops. Right in the center, here's a lace one. And there's another printed lace one. And when you look at that quilt, here's the same era, same color, and the same print. So that dates this little quilt to about 1880s. The next chapter of Victorian crazy quilts, 1880s to 19-teens. Again, look at our vignette. Look, we had so much fun with these. I hope we really do. I hope they really do set a context for the book. Imagine if the book was just one quilt per page. We wanted to kind of give some liveliness to the book. The little picture in this one has everything. When I talked to Virginia Gunn and asked her if I could borrow some of her photos, and she sent me a lot, I said, I'm looking for quilts, looking for photos that have, number one, a child, number two, a doll, child with doll, and especially one that had a doll quilt. This is the only photo that she sent that has all three components, the child, the doll, and the quilt. I think the little doll looks like she's dressed like the little girl, and the quilt in the picture has a lace border on it. Much like this quilt that is in Mary's collection. She called it Crazy with Lace. It's 18 inches long and 14 inches wide. It's upstairs too on one of the beds. But this quilt has another secret. Probably a lot of you in this room have looked closely at this quilt and realized what the secret is. But this is not a typical crazy quilt. The fabric here is cheater cloth. It's printed to look like a Victorian crazy quilt, including all of the owls, the spiders, the butterflies, and all of that edge embroidery. Now, when I found something like this on her quilts, I would, send off queries to some AQSG friends, and this one I actually sent to the American Textile Museum in Lowell. And I asked their curator, Diane Fagan-Affleck, if she knew the source of this fabric and the date of this fabric. She said it was probably manufactured by the Merrimack Printworks in New England in the 1880s. Although the museum owns a lot of the company's records, she found no printing record for this crazy quilt print. Now, I found out yesterday, going through the exhibit with one of the docents, that in the International Quilt Study Center owns two other large quilts that have this same crazy, pre-printed crazy quilt style cloth in it. Lots of interesting connections with this particular quilt. Here's another little crazy quilt. It's 14, it looks big here, but it's 14 inches by 14 inches. It is upstairs. Imagine, what are those blocks? They're probably a little over 2.5 inches on a side. This quilt too has a surprise on the backing fabric. Unfortunately, you can't see it, but here in the exhibit, but here in this presentation, I'm going to show it to you. On the back of the quilt is another cheater cloth pre-printed fabric. It has been conserved with netting, which is visible in the center of the quilt. I asked Diane Affleck at the museum about this design. I sent it to her, and she definitely linked this to the Cocheco Printworks of New Hampshire. The scenes, she said, in the backing, they have examples of this, and she said the scenes are from Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers, a very popular serial story novel in the 1800s. The museum owns a ledger from that company with information that's dated to the date it was printed, April 20th, 1880. Now this is pretty exciting to me. The next one is, it's always important to remember that not all crazy quilts were made of silks and satins. This one is made of cottons, and it's the one I plan to reproduce using Japanese cotton fabrics. Mary's, and I've been working on it for 2 years, it's not gotten much farther along than the layout. Mary's comments about this, again, are it was probably made by an adult because she says the fabrics lie flat and they are edged with simple, well-executed embroidery stitches. Quilts made by children are hard to prove because usually, but this quilt is easy to prove because it has been handed down in one family, the Gormley family. In the center, in the center part, towards the top, you see Mariah, 1904. Mariah was Nell Mariah Bodkin, Mary's mother-in-law, Roger Gormley's mother. She was born in 1888. In this photo, she's 12. In 1904, when she made the crazy quilt, she was 16 years old. She married John Gormley in Hutchinson, Kansas in October 1913. Her second child, Roger, was born in November 1918. Here she is, all grown up. As an adult, she was known as Nell Bodkin Ghormley. And she made this simple one-patch quilt for her granddaughters, Peggy, Phyllis, and Marilyn Gormley, in the 1950s. The quilt is still owned by Mary. I guess they haven't decided who's going to get the quilt. It's here today. We're going to show it to you later. Another quilt that has a story with it is one that came from a friend of Mary's, Jan Stellick. Some of you know her. She's a great quilt historian and collector from Nebraska. She got this small quilt, which we call brick wall, and this little pillow at an estate sale in Crete, Nebraska. Jan, like a good quilt historian, Jan jotted down the estate owners' names, Olga and Louis Mullineck. With the quilt came a note, and when she gave it to Mary, the note came with it. And when I saw this quilt, I saw the note and I said, whoa, this one is going to be in the book, but first I have to confirm it. After a search of the genealogy, we found the Mullineck family listed in the 1930 Nebraska census, and she was only a little girl, just a little over 1 year old. In 1940, she wasn't in the census. Now, I neglected to tell you what was on that note. The note said that the little girl who made the quilt died at the age of 12. So here it was, very, very clear in the census that we had the right little girl. And here's her picture. Her name is Doris, and this search underscores how important it is to sign and date quilts, even the smallest quilts, the most insignificant quilts, and keep the history with the quilt. Those little notes help. Here's another one, probably made by a child. It's upstairs. Wouldn't you like to know more about this quilt? Mary would say to me, and of course I would. To me, it looks like the mother made this quilt quickly for a little girl, a little child, who wanted a quilt now, right now, Mommy, for my baby doll. Luckily, a note was also attached to this quilt. It said, "Mama made this quilt when 6 years old in 1904. Whoa. Now, being a good quilt historian, and remember, I am from Missouri, the show me state, I have to be proved, or 2 or 3 ways. I needed to look closely at these fabrics, and sure enough, they are from this little quilt is full of fabrics from the turn of the century. So the story that was attached to the quilt of it being made in 1904 fits with the fabrics that I know. This one, lots of chuckles in the audience, I'm sure. This one is only 5 inches by 9 inches. And you wonder what is going on here. Little pieces, big pieces, pieces that are kind of cattywampus. It has similar fabrics too. We dated it to about 1900, 1910. I'm not sure if it's child made or if the mother might have used what she had on hand. This one too is one of my favorites and Mary's favorites. She named it Expanding One Patch. It has a wonderful piece on the back too. A lot of doll quilts have front and back designs on them. The next chapter I labeled Quilt Patterns, 1880s to the 1900s. You know that I'm really interested in finding primary sources for quilt patterns, and in the 1800s, a very good source was women's magazines. This was an era where the quilt block names became established because they were in print. I like using these sources to date quilts. This chapter is full of detective stories. I'm not going to tell you all of them, but I hope you sit down and read the captions. That's where the meat of some of this information is. I'll share a few here with you. This little block is 15 inches by 15 inches. The center, we named it, or Mary named it, Churn Dash. But in 1883, in Louisville Farm and Fireside magazine, a reader sent in this block on the bottom right, along with 3 other quilt patterns. Now, this was the time where readers would send in blocks and the editors would create little illustrations. And the editor named this a wrench. She wrote, the contributor wrote, "Many of the patterns you have published are so pretty, I thought I would add my mite by sending some of mine." This same block was published 14 years later in 1897 by the Ladies' Art Company of St. Louis, and they named it Double Wrench. And we also know it as, of course, Churn Dash, Hole in the Barn Door, and maybe several others. This is a page from the Ladies' Art Company catalog. And as you can see, they had 400 quilt blocks in this particular catalog, and they numbered them all. A quilt maker would get this catalog maybe from the mail or maybe ordered from a magazine. It came from St. Louis, and she would like choosing what seeds to buy. She would go through this and choose what quilt block she was interested in. She ordered each one based on the number. In the early catalogs, they did not have quilt names for the Ladies' Art Company. Like this one. This is one that's in Mary's, this is in her doll quilt collection. It's 19 inches by 19 inches. In the early catalogs, this block was only known as number 108. And the size of the block was 13 by 12 and a half inches. And it says calico for 35 cents. You could buy the patterns in a little envelope, and inside were some templates that were made out of tissue paper, or you could order a calico block already made up. And you could then make your quilt templates from that, or use it as a guide for making your quilt. For 35 cents, you could get this block. Now, I'm not saying this is for sure, but it's very possible that a block like the house block in the center could have come from Ladies' Art Company. She decided not to make a quilt out of it, but used it instead in a doll quilt by adding borders. This is another Ladies Art Company pattern. And here it's just simply number 370. Later on, they named it Sugar Loaf, which is the name that Mary used. Where did Mary get these names? From the Barbara Brackman Pieced Encyclopedia. Where did Barbara get these names? Various places, but a lot of them from the Ladies Art Company catalogs. This next quilt is not in the exhibit, but we have it to show you today. I think it's a really, really interesting little piece. Mary named it Medallion because it is a medallion quilt with a star quilt and star block in the center and borders worked around it. And those borders were probably added to fit a doll bed. It's 18 inches by 22 inches. The neat part on the back of the quilt is this, an M. M for Mary, maybe. I can assume, I wonder if maybe the child that this was made for was, maybe her name was Mary. We don't know. We can only, like Mary often says, if there's no story, we can imagine one. We can make one up. And that's the fun part about collecting doll quilts, too. It's a medallion. This M in the center is a single initial block M. Now, what's the source of this block? I knew this. When I saw it, I went, wow, I can tell another piece of quilt history. This letter M block was published in Hearth and Home magazine. Now, this is like a newspaper format basically for the farm women, but it was published in Augusta, Maine, and they were trying to put out a series of alphabet blocks. This letter M quilt was published in 1906, in February 1906. A reader, here she is, I've blown this up so you may be able to read it, but it says, she signed her name Busybody. They weren't going to put her real name in. Heaven forbid somebody might, track her down in Erie, Kansas. Anyway, she suggested that this style of letter makes a charming initial or alphabet quilt. When using several blocks in one quilt top, the editors went on and said to omit that border on every other block, making the border of the block do the joining. And I think if you look through your quilt books, and maybe even at the International Quilt Study Center, you're going to find a quilt or two. I think of the H quilts. There are lots of H quilts out there. I'm not sure why, but that's probably what they were doing, using a block like this. And this block on the back of Mary's quilt is constructed exactly as the published block in Hearth and Home. Notice it has the same borders in it between the red corner blocks, and the M is constructed exactly the same way. Now, there were other alphabet quilts in other published sources. This one is exact. I'm just sure that that's what's going on with this particular quilt. So with that information, you can't really date this quilt to any earlier than 1906 when it was published. The next chapter is on fabrics, turn-of-the-century fabrics, 1890s to 1900s. Mary also collected doll dresses. And why did she collect the doll dresses? Because they had fabrics in them that were also in the quilts. So we decided that we would do 3 or 4 of them to, again, kind of show in the book, kind of give a lesson on quilt history. This indigo blue fabric shown in a doll dress is usually dated 1900 to 1910. Notice very similar fabrics appear in the doll quilt shown in the background. Another thing to notice is this has that printed border in the bottom of the skirt and also in the sleeves, like I had shown earlier. In the pinwheel quilt in the back, also notice the turkey red fabric in the upper left and the morning fabric in the upper right. This limited color grouping often appear in quilts about 1900 to 1910. Here's a detail photo of the turkey red fabric in the upper left, and lo and behold, it's one of those sporting themed prints. I've never seen this one. It's croquet. See the croquet mallets and the ball and the little wickets. Lots of neat things you can find in doll quilts. Mourning print cloth. Again, women were in mourning after the Civil War. A lot of textile companies put out fabrics that were just a little bit fancier. They were print, and they named them mourning prints. The dress has it in it, and the doll quilt behind it. Here's the full quilt. Mourning prints show up in women's dresses and quilts about 1890 to 1910. 20th century quilts is the next chapter. We were interested in childhood literature, and this particular photo is mine. It shows a young girl reading a storybook, probably Mother Goose. I used a magnifying glass, I couldn't tell for sure. But she's sitting at a table with a red work embroidered cover on the table. Both the photo and the red work embroidery date to about 1900. Here is what's called a real photo postcard. This is the front of the postcard. It was a picture taken of a little girl and her doll baby. On the back is the message area, and I'll read it to you. It's a postcard. Now, this wasn't sent, but it was probably given to the, it was written on there, and it says, "This was your mommy playing nurse when she was a little girl. Keep it. Doesn't she look worried? I bet the baby had a temperature." And again, thanks from Virginia Gunn for that. This one too, probably in the 1930s. For me, growing up in the 1950s in suburban St. Louis, Missouri, playing house in the backyard, in the woods, was a favorite memory of my childhood. These young people are unidentified, but I'd suspect the time is the 1930s, and they are playing hospital. Notice the beds, the chairs, the dolls, and the folded doll quilts. Here's a quilt kit. I found it online. You can imagine how I got excited when it was doll quilts and kits and 1930s. I had to have it. And I love looking at the image here. We have a little girl working on a quilt top while her little doll sleeps in a crib tucked under a quilt. Inside the box are patches already cut, thread, needles, thimble, and a scissors, along with a pamphlet that shows how to create simple quilt blocks with these cutout pieces. Proof that quilt making for dolls, for children, for their dolls, was popular and going on. Mary's collection also includes grandmother's flower garden quilts from the 20th century, 1930s. This quilt is, this one is 13 inches by 16 inches. I suspect that this little doll quilt is made from pieces from an adult size quilt. This one, we couldn't go through the 20th century without talking about a yo-yo quilt. I especially chose this one because of the fabrics, the peach-colored rayon fabrics and the steel-colored kind of gray fabrics to represent the boudoir era in the 1920s when quilts were made in those colors and those shiny fabrics. And finally, this quilt, Mary had it. Especially in the 20th century, with so many published quilt patterns and kits, it's easier to identify and date quilt patterns. This little quilt on the left was originally a pillow, part of an ensemble. You could see it here on the right. The quilt kit cost $2.98, $2.98 for the quilt plus the thread. The pillow cost, the pillow cost 98 cents. The date of this catalog is 1962. Mary's original name for this quilt was Puppy Dog, and I can see why she would think that was Puppy Dog. But when I found this exact match, we changed the quilt name to teddy bear. Now, if you want to see all the quilts, I encourage you to get the book. If you want to see all 300 quilts in the Gormley collection, go to the website, the International Quilt Study Center and Museum website. They have, of course, they have thousands of quilts from their collection available for viewing online. And again, the website is www.quiltstudy.org. And then you could go down to the search page and pull down under collections. There's a menu. You go down to the Gormley collection, click on that, and all of her quilts will come up. So you can examine these quilts, photos and information on each one of her quilts. And what are you going to do with this information? If you're a quilt maker, you might make the quilts. If you're a quilt collector, well, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But dowel quilt ideas. Use old blocks and add borders. You've seen this done in some of these quilts we've talked about. Log cabin blocks work really well for small quilts. Make a miniature version of a favorite quilt. Use unfinished projects, why not, for the front and the back of these little dowel quilts. Use pillow projects and leftover embroidery projects in these quilts. But remember, work with a child and just let them play. Anne Hermes, I heard about her just recently, is reproducing the quilts in the book using antique fabrics. See her blog postings, Quilt Lab at blogspot.com, July 1 and July 4th, 2010. I asked her for permission to show this, and she was happy to show it. Here's a little vignette that she's put together. These are quilts that she has copied from the book using vintage fabrics. And here it is. Look at the one on the left is the Chintz quilt with a wide border. And the one on the right is that one I loved so much. I don't think she's done it quite as well. I would work a little bit better on it. But she's copied it exactly like the one in the book. And she fussy cut, like I was pointing out in the center. Well, I shouldn't say. I'm not a quilt maker. She's done a really good job with this. There are other people doing the same thing. It's interesting when you write a book and see what happens afterwards. If you're collecting dowel quilts, if you really want the very best dowel quilts, look for dowel quilts that were created as dowel quilts rather than simply cut from a full-size quilt. The quilt design should be proportional to the reduced size of the quilt. The pattern should not appear to be cut off. The back and the binding should be the same age as the top fabric. And yet, each dowel quilt has its own special charm, whether beautifully made, hurriedly assembled, or showing the clumsy workmanship of a beginner. And we hope, Mary and I, that you will save them all. The quirkier, the better. If you have them in your family, record the memories of the dowel and its quilt. If you see one in an antique store, consider giving it a home. We hope we've opened your eyes and hearts to these small wonders. Mary Campbell Ghormley is now 90 years old. She and her husband, Roger, sold their house and distributed family antiques. They live in a retirement community in Lincoln, Nebraska. Her dowel quilts and many of the beds with matching linens were acquired by the International Quilt Study Center at the University of Nebraska. The new International Quilt Study Center Museum at the University of Nebraska has a reading room named after Mary Gormley. The display cases hold rotating exhibits of her dowel quilts, and now they're making duplicates of her dowel quilts so that they don't fade in the sunshine. Mary continues to volunteer at the museum. This fall, the museum is showing a special exhibit of her dowel quilts from August 6th through December 12th, 2010. I wanted to show you some of the quilts that are in the book, but not in the exhibit. And Carolyn took them. I requested, and today she went into the storage and found them. This is the little red work quilt. We could turn that on. And it represents about 1910. Mary, did you want to say anything about it?
Well, it has hearts all around. I think it was made for somebody sentimentally.
It has hearts all around it, and she thinks that obviously has a sentimental feeling. Here's the back. You can see the back of them. Here's another one that's in that chapter with all the little detective things. This one we called, I can't remember what you called it.
Jemima Puddle.
But in the end, we found out it was called Jemima Puddle Duck. And it's a Beatrice Potter design and not a Mother Goose. I think it was originally called Mother Goose. But it's a Jemima Puddle Duck on this one. Beautiful juvenile fabric on the back, juvenile print fabric, and the same fabric is used on the front. And then here's one called Lambs, L-A-M-B. They're little lambs. This is a series. I think it's in the book, but it's a Clark Company series. They were stamped blocks, and in fact, they were even tinted. And you bought them. You were supposed to cut them up and put them in a bigger quilt. But this woman just got this far and decided, I'm going to make a doll quilt out of it. Now look at the back on this. Ooh, is that gorgeous? I just love that image. We date the front to 1932 because these were published in, there was even a copyright on the pattern, 1932. So I would assume this would be 32 or later. We're not sure of that, though. And then here's the Medallion quilt, one of my personal favorites. It goes like this. And here's the back, the M. And these are the Gormley family pieces. This is Mariah Bodkin. She made it in 1904. It says Maria right there in 1904, but Roger said his mother's name was pronounced Mariah. It's wonderful to be able to get oral history, that kind of information. Otherwise, this little quilt is, yes, it's dated, it might have been saved, but now we know a lot more because of the direct connection to the family. Look at the back of it. They never put a backing on it. What was she, about 16 when she made this? And then she made this for the grandchildren in the 1950s. And did I get all the names right? Yes, Peggy, Phyllis, and Marilyn. A one patch, 1950s fabrics, and well, I can't tell right here. I think it's machine, yes, it's machine quilted. Mary also likes to point out in her lectures, dolls could be anything, and you can imagine, can make things appear to become dolls. This is a little corn cob with a little ball of string on the top, and the little girl dressed it. I think Mary made this. Yes. I love this quilt. And when it wasn't upstairs, I thought, oh, I wanted to see it again because I might reproduce some of these. I'm not really a quilt maker, but these little doll quilts are really making me think about, well, maybe I can do it. They're small projects. Look at this. It's four 9 patches, but by putting the red as the setting fabric and a white in the center, there's a lot of, you see it, optical illusions happening with this, just a really simple piece, but there's a lot of thought behind it, and I appreciate whoever made this particular quilt. It too has another pieced quilt on the back. We think it's about 1910. And finally, Mary wanted me to show this for her quilting friends. It was a friendship quilt made as a doll quilt. And on it are some of the names of people that are dear to her. Janet Sullivan, Jan Lau, Betty Duncan, Hope Partridge, Gretchen Garcia, Jean Davey, Mary Gormley, Ruth Massengale, Diane Wagner, and Mona Jean. Another way to make a little quilt. And Ruth is here?
She's here.
Well, hi, so you're on here. You are now part of the Gormley collection. That's a family piece. Okay, that's the quilts I brought. You're welcome to come up and look at them. There are some other ones that people have brought in. This is from Jan's collection. These quilts are still out there. These are doll quilts she recently got at an estate sale, I think here in Lincoln. A bar quilt. We think this might be the oldest one of the group, probably 1870s. This one with the blues is probably right at 1890, 1900. This red and white one is probably 1910. This says interesting quilting on the back. It's like the quilting stitches started, but she didn't finish. See that? I think that's the other part about doll quilts. They do make you laugh and make you a lot of chuckles from them. This has a lot of mourning cloth in it, right here, and on the back, another wonderful backing. This is a little 4-patch. It is machine quilted. And finally, the one that Jan likes, I like this one too, is another medallion quilt with borders on either side, probably made to fit the bed that it was being made for. It doesn't have a back on it. It's probably been washed. And finally, I wanted to tell you, I'm helping, my sisters and I are helping close up my father's house in St. Louis. We were there a week ago. And lo and behold, we found one more box of things of the sisters. There were 3 little sisters, dolls and doll furniture, and my sister Sally starts pulling out this cloth and she says, oh my gosh, and it was like scrunched up, and I said, it's a quilt. It's a doll quilt. And there were 3 of us, and there were 3 doll quilt projects. And I brought them home, and the littlest one that my sister Carol would have made, probably about the age of 4, looks like those funny little expanding 1-patches. And the other ones look like this from the 1850s. 1950s, I'm not that old. I want to thank the photographer, David Kostelnik, here he is. The photographer, is he here? But his wife is, no, he's not here. When you hire a photographer, you don't usually hire a designer. This man did many things for us and really gave a spark to the book. And my thanks also to Virginia Gunn for allowing me to include her vintage photos in the book. And of course, Roger and Mary Gormley. Thank you for being my friends, for trusting me, for asking me to do this book. And from both of us, thank you. This has been a collaboration, a labor of love. We finished it and we're still friends. Thank you.